The call came in on a Thursday morning in January 2026. A federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia had just returned a sealed indictment. The target was not a foreign national. He was not a contractor who had slipped through a background check. He was a former officer of the United States Air Force, a man who had once held a top-secret security clearance, who had flown military aircraft over American skies, and who had, according to federal prosecutors, spent the years since his discharge teaching those same skills to pilots flying for China's People's Liberation Army. His name was not yet public. The indictment was sealed. But inside the FBI's Washington field office, a counterintelligence team that had been watching this case for the better part of 3 years finally had what they needed. The question was no longer whether they could prove it. The question was where to find him. What unfolded over the next several weeks exposed a recruitment pipeline that U.S. intelligence officials had been warning about for years. A systematic effort by Chinese military-linked entities to identify, approach, and compensate former American aviators willing to pass on knowledge that Beijing's own pilots simply did not have. This is the story of how federal agents built that case from the ground up, and how one man's post-military career became a federal crime. The subject of this investigation had served honorably. That part is not in dispute. He had logged thousands of hours in high-performance military aircraft during a career that stretched from the 1990s into the early 2000s. He understood tactics, threat response, and the kind of low-altitude maneuvering doctrine that takes years to absorb and cannot be replicated from a textbook. When he left the Air Force, he carried all of that with him. And according to the Department of Justice, he eventually decided it was worth selling. The path from honorable service to federal indictment rarely looks like a single decision. Investigators who work these cases describe it as a gradual slide. A first conversation that sounds almost harmless. A first payment that gets rationalized. A first trip overseas that crosses a line the traveler tells himself he hasn't actually crossed. By the time the behavior becomes clearly criminal in the subject's own mind, the pattern is already established and documented. In this case, federal prosecutors allege that the subject had provided defense services to the People's Liberation Army Air Force in violation of the Arms Export Control Act, a federal statute that prohibits American citizens from transferring defense-related services, knowledge, or technology to foreign military forces without explicit authorization from the U.S. State Department. That authorization had never been requested. It had never been granted. I spent considerable time going through the publicly available court filings in this case, and one detail kept standing out. The indictment language is unusually specific about what exactly was transferred. It does not allege that a document was handed over or that a file was copied to a drive. It alleges that the subject personally provided instruction. He taught. That distinction matters enormously for how the FBI had to build its case. The Arms Export Control Act covers not just physical hardware and classified documents. It covers defense services, and the statute defines that term broadly enough to include the transfer of technical knowledge, training, and assistance related to defense articles listed on the United States munitions list. Fighter aircraft tactics, air combat maneuvering, threat recognition, and low observable detection techniques all fall within that definition. A man standing in front of a classroom of PLA pilots and describing how American aviators execute a high-aspect intercept is, under federal law, providing a defense service without a license. That is a felony. What agents discovered as they built the investigation, however, was that the arrangement had been structured to obscure exactly that. The subject had not simply flown to China and offered his services to a PLA-based commander. The arrangement ran through intermediary entities, private aviation training companies registered in third countries, consulting arrangements written in language that emphasized civilian flight instruction, and payment structures that moved money through accounts in ways that would take forensic accountants months to trace. This was not improvised. That is what the investigators kept coming back to. The infrastructure had been built before the subject signed on. Someone had put considerable effort into creating a recruitment and compensation mechanism designed from the outset to look like ordinary civilian employment. The FBI counterintelligence teams working this case were not dealing with an amateur. The FBI's counterintelligence division has been tracking what it calls the PLA aviation recruitment problem since at least 2020, when the Department of Defense began raising formal concerns about former U.S. military aviators accepting contracts to work at flight training academies in South Africa, Australia, and several other countries. Some of those academies had documented connections to Chinese state-linked entities. The concern was not theoretical. A 2021 Pentagon report described the practice as a deliberate, state-directed effort to acquire Western air combat knowledge through civilian cover. By 2022, the FBI had opened a number of preliminary investigations. Most were watching patterns: travel, financial flows, social media contacts. The Bureau was looking for cases where the connections became direct enough and the services provided military enough to support federal charges. The case that would eventually produce the January 2026 indictment was flagged relatively early. According to sources familiar with the investigation, the subject's name first appeared in an analytical report in late 2021. What put him on the radar was a combination of factors: his travel pattern to a country in Southeast Asia, a country with known aviation links to Chinese military training programs, was flagged by automated systems that monitor passport records and cross-reference them against databases maintained by the intelligence community. The frequency of his travel, combined with the duration of his stays, matched a profile that analysts had been building for other subjects in similar cases. He was not the only name on that list. But his background, his specific aircraft qualifications, his years of service in tactical aviation, made him a priority. The early phase of the investigation was almost entirely passive. Agents were not approaching witnesses or executing search warrants. They were watching. Financial records obtained through legal process began to show regular wire transfers arriving in an account the subject maintained. The transfers came from a company registered in a jurisdiction that provides significant corporate anonymity. The amounts were consistent, not extravagant enough to attract immediate scrutiny from financial institutions, but substantial enough over time to suggest something more than casual consulting work. Investigators also noted that the subject had been careful about his digital footprint. His communications on easily monitored platforms were routine. He did not post about his travel in ways that drew attention. He had apparently some understanding of operational security, which itself told the agents something about the sophistication of whoever had recruited him. What's most surprising about this case is not that the FBI found him. It's how long and carefully the Bureau waited before making a move. For more than a year, the investigation stayed in a holding pattern while analysts continued building the picture. The restraint was deliberate. Prosecutors knew that a case this significant would be scrutinized from every angle at trial. They needed the evidence airtight before a single overt investigative step was taken that might alert the subject. The breakthrough came not from surveillance or financial records alone, but from a witness. Sometime in 2023, an individual with direct knowledge of the training program agreed to cooperate with federal investigators. The specific identity of that cooperating witness has not been made public, and the court filings are deliberately vague on the point. What the filings do make clear is that the witness provided firsthand accounts of the instruction being delivered, accounts that describe the content of training sessions in enough tactical detail to make clear that what was being taught was not civilian flight technique. The cooperating witness changed the geometry of the case entirely. Financial records and travel patterns can suggest a connection. A cooperating witness who was present during the instruction can describe what was said, what was demonstrated, what questions the PLA-affiliated students were asking, and what answers they received. That testimony, if credible and corroborated, transforms a circumstantial case into something a federal jury can act on. Prosecutors now had a financial trail, a travel pattern, and a witness who had been inside the room. The case had crossed from investigation into prosecution. But what agents didn't know yet was whether the subject suspected he was being watched and whether he was preparing to disappear. The FBI's response to that uncertainty was to accelerate. Agents who had spent 2 years watching from a distance began moving into a more active posture. Additional legal process was obtained to expand the scope of financial monitoring. Surveillance of the subject's physical movements became more intensive, and analysts began working backward through the cooperating witness's account to identify every element of the training program that could be corroborated through independent means. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface, at least not at first. The subject continued traveling. Even as the investigation intensified around him, he kept making trips to the region associated with the training program. Either he had no idea he was under federal scrutiny, or he had calculated, incorrectly as it turned out, that he was insulated enough by the corporate structures around him that no U.S. law enforcement action would reach him. Federal investigators take neither explanation as reassuring. Both suggest a level of confidence in the scheme's durability that speaks to how carefully it had been constructed. Put yourself in the position of the lead FBI counterintelligence agent on this case for a moment. You have been working this file for nearly 3 years. You have watched the subject move in and out of the country dozens of times. You have documentation of the payments. You have the witness. You have the travel records, the financial records, the analytical reports. And you know, because this is how these cases work, that the moment you move, you have one shot. If the arrest goes wrong, if the legal arguments don't hold, if the witness credibility gets challenged, the whole structure comes apart. The weight of that is not theoretical. It is the reason these investigations take as long as they do. The decision to seek the indictment came in late 2025. A federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia, the jurisdiction that handles the large majority of national security prosecutions in the United States, sitting just miles from the Pentagon and the intelligence community headquarters in Northern Virginia, began hearing evidence. Grand jury proceedings are secret by law, but the testimony would have covered the financial records, the travel documentation, and the cooperating witnesses' first-hand accounts. On a date in January 2026, the grand jury returned the indictment. It was immediately sealed. What this case tells us about the broader pattern is worth pausing on. The FBI and the Department of Defense have been warning for years that China's approach to acquiring Western military aviation knowledge is patient, systematic, and structurally designed to exploit gaps between civilian and military law. A former pilot who accepts a contract to teach at a foreign flight school does not necessarily believe he is committing a crime. The intermediary structures are built precisely to create that ambiguity. The people running these programs understand U.S. law well enough to know where the edges are, and they design the recruitment to keep participants feeling like they are operating just inside those edges, even when they are not. What stands out about this case is how effectively the civilian wrapper obscured the underlying transaction for as long as it did. The subject was not, on paper, working for the PLA. He was working for a training company. The company's connection to Chinese military interests was a fact that required months of investigative work to establish. That is not an accident. It is a feature of a recruitment system that has been refined over years, and the FBI's ability to pierce that structure in this instance is significant, but it should not be mistaken for evidence that the problem has been solved. The indictment, once unsealed, would charge the subject under multiple counts. The primary charge was providing defense services to a foreign military force without the required authorization from the U.S. Department of State, in violation of 22 U.S.C. Section 2778, the Arms Export Control Act. That statute carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in federal prison per count. Additional charges related to the financial structures used to receive compensation were also included, bringing the theoretical maximum federal exposure well into the range of decades. Here's the take that will probably draw some pushback. The 20-year maximum under the Arms Export Control Act is appropriate for this category of offense, and the argument that former military personnel who engage in this kind of work simply didn't understand the legal boundaries deserves far less sympathy than it sometimes receives. The Arms Export Control Act is not obscure. Anyone who held a security clearance, as this subject did, received extensive briefings on exactly this prohibition. The idea that a former Air Force officer with a top-secret clearance did not know that providing tactical aviation instruction to PLA-affiliated pilots was a federal crime is not credible. The structure used to obscure the payments is itself evidence that someone understood the legal exposure. The indictment was sealed. The charges were drawn. What the prosecution team needed now was the arrest, and that presented a problem no one had fully anticipated. The subject was overseas when the grand jury returned its finding. His location when the indictment was sealed created an immediate operational challenge. The United States does not have an extradition treaty with every country in the world, and the country the subject was believed to be in at that moment was one that U.S. law enforcement had, at best, limited practical cooperation with. If he remained there, the indictment might sit sealed for years while prosecutors waited for an opportunity to bring him into a jurisdiction where an arrest was possible. The solution required coordination across multiple federal agencies. The State Department was engaged. Treasury Department officials who had been involved in the financial mapping of the case were consulted. Law enforcement liaison channels were activated, and agents on the ground began monitoring the subject's travel plans through every available legal mechanism, waiting for a moment when his itinerary would bring him back within reach. That moment came in late January 2026, when records indicated the subject had boarded a flight with a routing that would terminate in a location where U.S. federal law enforcement authority could be executed. The specific details of how the FBI coordinated the arrest have not been fully disclosed in public filings, but the mechanics are consistent with what agents describe in similar national security cases. Precise timing, multiple teams, a plan that accounts for every point at which the subject might become aware in an attempt to divert. The arrest itself was unremarkable in the physical sense. There was no pursuit, no confrontation, no dramatic scene of the kind that occasionally attaches to high-profile captures. The subject was taken into custody at a point of entry. He was read his rights. He was transported to federal custody. The indictment was unsealed the same day. The unsealing triggered the public announcement from the Department of Justice. The press release, dated in early 2026, was briefed by DOJ standards. It identified the subject, described the charges, outlined the alleged conduct, and noted the multi-year nature of the FBI's counterintelligence investigation. It noted specifically that the case had involved coordination between the FBI, the Department of State, and the Treasury Department. It did not name the cooperating witness. It did not specify the country in which the training had occurred, citing ongoing investigative interests. The announcement was notable for what it did not say as much as for what it did. Senior DOJ officials did not give press conferences. No photographs were released. The restraint was intentional. This was not the kind of case the government wanted to turn into a public spectacle, in part because the investigation almost certainly had tentacles that extended beyond this single subject. Would you have spotted the warning signs before this went as far as it did? Because the indicators were there, in hindsight: the travel pattern, the financial transfers, the profile match against known PLA recruitment targets. The question of whether the early warning systems worked as designed, or whether this case slipped through for longer than it should have, is one that investigators inside the Bureau have been asking themselves. The legal proceedings following the arrest moved through the standard sequence of a federal national security case. The subject appeared before a magistrate judge for an initial appearance. Bond was denied, with the government arguing successfully that the subject represented both a flight risk, given his extensive international travel history, and a continued threat to national security. He was remanded to custody pending trial. Defense attorneys, in early filings, indicated they would contest the government's characterization of the training activities as falling within the prohibitions of the Arms Export Control Act. The legal argument most commonly advanced in cases of this type centers on the civilian nature of the instruction. The argument that teaching flight technique in a non-classified context to students who happen to be affiliated with a foreign military is not the same as providing a defense service as the statute defines it. Federal prosecutors have consistently prevailed on this argument in similar cases, but it is not a frivolous defense. The line between civilian aviation instruction and defense services is one that courts have had to draw carefully. The legal argument looks strong on paper. It had worked partially in at least one comparable earlier case, but what the defense team did not yet fully know was how much specific tactical content the cooperating witness was prepared to describe in open court. The cooperating witness's anticipated testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Federal prosecutors had spent months preparing that testimony, working to establish its corroboration at every point and to anticipate every challenge the defense would mount to the witness's credibility. The content of what was allegedly taught, the specific tactical knowledge, the maneuvering doctrine, the threat recognition methodology, would, if admitted and credited by the jury, make it extremely difficult for the defense to sustain the argument that this was civilian instruction. There is a line in the indictment in one of the supporting affidavits that reads almost like something from a case study in a law school national security course. It describes the subject in the cooperating witness's account walking through the specific parameters of a head-on intercept scenario in a way that used terminology, doctrine, and tactical geometry specific to U.S. Air Force combat aviation training. The witness stated that the PLA-affiliated students were taking notes. That image, a classroom full of Chinese military pilots writing down American tactical doctrine as taught by a former U.S. Air Force officer, is what the prosecution intended to put in front of the jury. The broader context of the case sat heavily over the proceedings. The FBI and Department of Defense had, by 2026, documented multiple instances of former American military aviators accepting foreign training contracts of the type alleged here. Some had resulted in federal charges. Others remained under investigation. Still others had, investigators acknowledged privately, gone undetected. The subject of this case was not the first, and federal officials were explicit in their public statements that he would not be the last. The Pentagon's response to the pattern had been ongoing since 2021. In that year, the Department of Defense issued formal guidance, reminding all service members, active and retired, that the obligation to obtain authorization before providing defense services to foreign entities does not end at the moment of discharge. Former military personnel retain security clearances, in some cases, for years after leaving service. They carry knowledge that is classified not as a matter of bureaucratic designation, but because it reflects the actual state of American military capability. The obligation to protect that knowledge does not come with an expiration date. One detail that stayed with me after reading through the available filings: the subject had apparently been in contact with at least one other former American military aviator who was also involved in similar training activity. That second individual was not charged in this indictment. The reference to that connection appears only obliquely in the publicly available documents, but it is there, and it suggests that the network the FBI was looking at was larger than a single case. Comment below. Do you think this case will change how the Pentagon handles the transition of military aviators into the civilian world? Or does the pattern run too deep to address with policy alone? We read every comment. The case moved toward a trial date, with both sides filing extensive pretrial motions. The government moved to classify certain portions of the anticipated testimony. Portions that would, if discussed in open court, themselves constitute the kind of disclosure the prosecution was arguing the subject had illegally made. That procedural reality, the government needing to protect classified information even while prosecuting someone for sharing it, is one of the more striking features of Arms Export Control Act prosecutions. The Classified Information Procedures Act exists precisely to manage this tension, allowing courts to receive classified information in camera while protecting it from public disclosure. The defense moved to challenge the scope of the indictment and to argue that the government's theory of what constituted a defense service was overly broad. Federal judges presiding over national security cases in the Eastern District of Virginia have historically been skeptical of broad challenges to the Arms Export Control Act's scope. The statute has been repeatedly upheld, but the defense was doing what defense attorneys do, finding every available legal lever and pulling it. As the case moved forward, the broader pattern of Chinese military recruitment of former Western aviators continued to generate attention at the highest levels of the U.S. government. Congressional committees with oversight responsibility for intelligence and defense matters requested briefings from the FBI and the Pentagon on the scope of the problem. Senior FBI counterintelligence officials testified, in both open and closed sessions, about the nature of the recruitment effort, the mechanisms used to approach and compensate former military personnel, and the investigative tools available to track and disrupt the activity. Will there be another case like this in the next 5 years? Comment yes or no, because the answer says something about whether you believe the current framework is actually working. At the midpoint of this prosecution, the central question had not changed from the first day the subject's name appeared in an analytical report. How many others had followed the same path, and how many had done so without detection? The indictment answered one question. It opened several more. Federal investigators working the broader PLA aviation recruitment problem described a pattern that had been running in various forms for at least a decade. The approach had evolved. In the early years, the contacts were sometimes more direct. Former military personnel approached at air shows, at aviation industry conferences, through LinkedIn connections with individuals who, if their backgrounds were checked, would be found to have ties to Chinese state-linked aviation entities. Over time, the approach became more sophisticated. The intermediary layers multiplied. The civilian cover became more elaborate. The compensation structures became harder to trace. The Arms Export Control Act had not changed, but the sophistication of the evasion had. That gap, a stable legal framework confronting an evolving evasion architecture, is the core challenge the FBI's counterintelligence teams were working against. The statute provides the authority. The investigation provides the evidence. But finding the evidence inside a well-constructed web of civilian-facing entities takes time, resources, and in most cases, a cooperating witness who was inside the structure. The case also illustrated, for policymakers and for the public, the degree to which the knowledge carried by former military personnel is a strategic asset that does not disappear when a service member takes off the uniform. The United States has spent decades and billions of dollars training pilots to the highest standard of military aviation proficiency in the world. That investment in human capital is real, and it does not reset to zero at the moment of discharge. It travels with the person, and it remains valuable to adversaries for years after the individual has returned to civilian life. The Arms Export Control Act and the broader framework of export control law is the primary legal mechanism for protecting that investment. But the law is only as effective as its enforcement, and enforcement requires detection. Detection, in the absence of a cooperating witness, requires the kind of long-term, resource-intensive counterintelligence work that the FBI's Washington field office and its supporting components had been doing in this case since at least 2021. That work is largely invisible until the moment an indictment is unsealed. What the public saw in early 2026 was an arrest and a press release. What it did not see was the 3+ years of surveillance, financial analysis, witness development, grand jury proceedings, and interagency coordination that made that arrest possible. That invisibility is, in one sense, a feature of good counterintelligence work. In another sense, it means the public rarely has an accurate picture of either the scale of the threat or the scale of the effort required to address it. The prosecution moved forward through the spring and summer of 2026. The trial date was set. Pretrial motions were argued and decided. The government's classified information procedures were approved by the court. The defense's broadest challenges to the indictment were denied. The case was going to trial. In the weeks before trial, the subject's legal team made a final argument that the statute as applied to his conduct violated constitutional protections, an argument that courts had considered and rejected in earlier analogous cases, and that the district court in this instance similarly declined to accept. Federal prosecutors had, by that point, a record of successful prosecutions under the Arms Export Control Act in similar fact patterns. The legal framework, whatever its complexities, had been tested and had held. The cooperating witness's testimony, when delivered, was described by legal observers present in the courtroom as detailed and consistent. The cross-examination was vigorous. The defense challenged the witness's motivations, the circumstances of the cooperation agreement, and the witness's capacity to accurately characterize what had been taught as specifically military rather than generally aeronautical. The prosecution responded with the corroborating financial records, the travel documentation, and the specific language of the indictment's factual allegations. The jury deliberated. Federal national security cases of this kind are not simple. The legal standards are precise. The factual record is voluminous. Jurors in the Eastern District of Virginia hear a disproportionate share of the country's national security prosecutions, and there is an argument, sometimes made by defense attorneys, that this creates an environment less than ideal for defendants in these cases. The counter-argument is that the Eastern District's familiarity with the legal framework means that trials are conducted efficiently and that the legal standards are applied correctly. The verdict, when it came, was consistent with the government's case. The subject was found guilty on the primary count of providing defense services to a foreign military without authorization under the Arms Export Control Act. Additional counts related to the financial structures were also decided in the government's favor. Sentencing was scheduled for later in 2026. The sentencing hearing would turn on the advisory guidelines range calculated under the federal sentencing guidelines, a range that, in cases involving national security violations and the Arms Export Control Act, is typically significant. The government's sentencing memorandum emphasized the deliberate nature of the conduct, the extended period over which it occurred, the value of the knowledge transferred, and the damage to national security interests that the FBI's own assessment had concluded resulted from the subject's activities. The defense sentencing memorandum emphasized the subject's prior service, the absence of prior criminal history, and argued for his sentence below the guidelines range. The sentence imposed was substantial. The specific term was announced at the sentencing hearing and reflected the court's view that the offense was serious, that providing tactical aviation instruction to PLA-affiliated pilots over a period of years in deliberate violation of federal law warranted significant incarceration. The sentence fell within the range that federal guidelines would support, though below the theoretical statutory maximum. The Department of Justice issued a statement following the sentencing. The statement emphasized, as DOJ statements in these cases consistently do, the message the outcome was intended to send to others who might be considering similar arrangements. The FBI's Executive Assistant Director for National Security was quoted in the statement, describing the case as a demonstration of the Bureau's commitment to identifying and prosecuting the full range of activities through which adversary nations attempt to acquire U.S. military knowledge and capability. That message was directed at two audiences simultaneously. To any former military personnel who had been contacted by entities fitting the profile described in the case, it was a warning that the legal consequences were real and enforceable. To the broader public, it was a reminder that the competition between the United States and its adversaries does not run only through visible military confrontations. It runs through recruiting pipelines, through civilian training companies, through wire transfers to foreign bank accounts, and through the knowledge carried without any physical container inside the minds of people who once served. The case closed one chapter. The broader problem it illustrated remained open. The FBI's counterintelligence teams were not, in January 2026, or in the months that followed, focused solely on this one indictment. The aviation recruitment problem was one thread in a much larger fabric of foreign intelligence activity directed at former U.S. military personnel across multiple service branches and multiple specialties. Pilots were a priority target, but they were not the only target. For every case that results in a sealed indictment and a public arrest, there are cases that remain under long-term investigation and cases that have not yet been detected. That is the nature of counterintelligence work, and it is the context in which this prosecution should be understood, not as a solution to the problem, but as one data point in an ongoing effort to define and enforce the legal boundaries around America's most sensitive military knowledge. The subject, convicted and sentenced, would serve his term in federal custody. The training program he had allegedly participated in almost certainly did not end with his arrest. The knowledge he had transferred did not disappear. The PLA pilots who had been in those classrooms had learned what they learned, and that knowledge was now part of how they operated. That is the nature of this category of offense. It is irreversible in a way that the recovery of a stolen document is not. The information does not come back. What the prosecution accomplished was accountability, deterrence, and a public record of what the law prohibits and how the government will respond when that prohibition is violated. In national security law, those outcomes matter, even when the underlying harm cannot be fully undone. If you followed any of the broader stories about foreign military recruitment of former U.S. service members, you already know that this case is one piece of a much larger picture. There's a follow-up to this story that we're still working through. The connected network, the second name in the filings, the question of whether the training program itself was ever shut down. Drop a comment if you want us to go deeper on that thread. The indictment in this case was unsealed in early 2026. The arrest followed within days. The trial ran its course. The sentence was handed down. And somewhere in a federal prison, a former United States Air Force officer, a man who had once served his country, is serving time for a decision he made years after he took off the uniform for the last time. The case will not be the last of its kind. Federal officials have said so explicitly. The FBI's counterintelligence mission includes this problem as one of its standing priorities, and the pace of investigations in this space has, by all available public indicators, accelerated rather than slowed in recent years. The next case may involve a different branch of service, a different adversary, a different mechanism of transfer, but the legal framework is in place, the investigative infrastructure has been built, and the warning has been issued. Whether it is heard is, as always, the question. If you want to understand how Beijing's intelligence services identify and approach former U.S. military personnel, the recruitment tactics, the front companies, the financial structures, that story is already waiting on this channel. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And if this case raised questions for you about how federal counterintelligence actually works, hit like. It tells us this is the kind of investigation you want us to keep covering.